GiveWell has evaluated charities in U.S. poverty, international poverty, global health, microfinance, and disaster relief. So if you guys have kind of, and we've looked a lot at the nonprofit world. So any general questions, I'm happy to answer, and I will try to leave a good amount of time for Q&A at the end. So GiveWell started with just me working at a hedge fund with a bunch of friends, all trying to figure out where to give to charity. And we wanted to accomplish as much good as possible. I think we were all just kind of used to the paradigm where when you make a major purchase, you can Google around and get a good deal. And we didn't really find that for charity. I think at that time, the main way people were evaluating charities was illustrated by this chart, which is kind of how much of your money is going to program expenses versus admin and fundraising, which you might consider overhead. This is a metric that in some ways is appealing. It's very easy to calculate. You can calculate it equally easily for any charity, whether that be, education or an opera house or a global health program, or in this case, the U.S. Golf Association. And that to me is kind of the problem with that metric, is that it really is telling you nothing about what a charity is accomplishing. It's just telling you about a very high level accounting classification of how they're spending their money. When we were looking around, we were asking questions like, what's the best way to help inner city kids learn? Is it tutoring? Is it redoing the whole school? Is it charter school? Is it maybe something outside the educational system in the community? You can't answer that question with a chart like this. And that's always been our fundamental issue with the way that charities have been evaluated using these financials. I'm also happy to talk about other weaknesses with that. I mean, there was a 2009 press release where basically all of the charity evaluators came together and said this metric needs to stop getting so much emphasis. And that even included Charity Navigator and the ones that have been promoting the metric for years. At that time, I got together a bunch of friends, and we were all kind of trying to figure out what's the best charity, what can we do to find the best charity. As I discussed, we weren't finding the ratings agencies helpful at all. The next thing we kind of tried doing was calling foundations, because we said, okay, they have a lot of money to give away, they're working hard at it, they spend a lot on it, let's call them up and ask, what charity should I give to? And there we also got pretty much no answers. People would tell us to go check out Charity Navigator. This goes back to the first bullet. Or people would tell us to check out their grantees, which would often be hundreds of organizations with like one line on each on their website. So the third thing we tried, our group, is we started calling charities. And that's when we really discovered what we feel is a major problem in the sector, which is that when we started calling charities and asking what I feel are pretty basic questions about their impact and about their activities, a lot of times we just got treated like we were from outer space. We got a lot of charities, some of them were grateful. They said, we've never gotten questions this tough. Some of them were hostile. One charity accused me of being undercover for another charity. But the one common thread, I'm serious, but the one common thread was that nobody seemed to be ready for these questions and nobody seemed to be able to answer them. And just to be clear, I mean, I'm not talking about crazy questions. I'm talking about things like, how much money are you spending on each geographic region? Or, what is the evidence of effectiveness? And are you concerned about this and that methodological issue in this study you just sent us? And, how would you deal with that? So those are the kind of questions we were struggling with. Now, at that time, we still weren't sure this was a big deal, and we kind of had this as a part-time project. And one of the kind of things in the back of my mind was, well, maybe I can't give my $5,000 away well, but maybe this is a problem that doesn't need solving. I mean, if you added up all the $5,000 donors, what would it really add up to? Would it be anywhere near what Gates gives away? But the answer is yes, it would actually be a lot more. So this is kind of the standard giving statistics from Giving USA. The picture would get more complicated if you started trying to take out church and all that, but there actually was a study done with, I think, Center for Philanthropy at Indiana and Google working together that got at this better. And the picture is pretty much the same any way you look at it, which is that the Gates Foundation gives away a couple billion a year. They're, several times bigger than the next biggest foundation. And even if you add up all the foundations, they're just nowhere near giving away as much as individuals. So when we started discovering this stuff, we started realizing that most of the well-meaning money is coming from people who are in the same predicament we were in, who basically had no good way of finding good information about where to give. So it was after about a year of this that we started GiveWell. my friend Ellie and I were the most passionate about the project. We were kind of finding ourselves more interested in it than in the hedge fund work. So we left our jobs. We went to our former coworkers and my former boss and everyone, and we, said we needed to raise money to start up an independent evaluator that would try to do a better job of, finding great charities and publishing the details of our analysis. We've been around for coming up on 4 years, and our methodology has changed a lot over the years, but the basic core elements are that we take donations from people who believe in our mission, so we don't solicit the general public for donations. It's usually like people who are a little closer to us. When we do talk to the general public, we tell them to give to our top charities. We track the amount of money we direct to our top charities, and we use that as leverage to get to talk to charities and investigate them. And we basically combine academic literature and conversations with charities in order to get a picture of who's doing the most good. And a really core part of what we do is that we publish it all. So there's a lot of foundations out there maybe doing similar work to us. It still is hard for me to tell, even after getting contacts with a lot of them. But what we're really all about is that you can go to our website and you can follow each step of our process. And then we'll submit each step in addition to external review when we can from people who ought to know. So we're really about, finding the best charities and then publishing everything that went into that decision, because we know it's a subjective decision and we know there's judgment calls, and we want to make ourselves accountable and be able to start a public debate about this stuff, which I don't feel is happening now. So the first topic I'm going to talk about, and the main topic, is disaster relief, just because this has been in the headlines and we've done a lot of work on this lately. I'm going to talk about both the Haiti earthquake and the Japan earthquake, which are the two kind of recent headline-grabbing disasters. And I think there's lessons here for just general effective giving that are interesting. So the Haiti earthquake was in January 2010. It was really severe. There was obviously, anyone who's watching the news knows, there was a horrible situation down there and a lot of suffering. And in that context, one of the things that was a bit surprising was the slow pace of spending. So this is as of about a year after the earthquake, which is about when we did our last sort of in-depth report. And we estimated over $5 billion given or pledged to earthquake relief, with less than a third of that being spent. And this is, definitely raises a puzzle when you consider some of the needs on the ground. At that time, they still had only about half the people left homeless had even been put in transitional shelters. The rest of them were living under tarps and tents and in camps. There were just all kinds of problems on the ground that were crying out for attention. There was even a cholera outbreak at one point, which you would definitely think that if you could spend more money to control a cholera outbreak, you would do so. So there were a few different theories floating around as to why the spending was so slow and why all that money was kind of sitting there. I'm going to go through them one at a time. I think the dominant narrative in the media was to kind of blame the charities for spending money too slowly. And this quote is kind of representative of other quotes that we saw that was just kind of, what's going on here? And, don't the poor come first? Why are you guys holding on to this money? I never found this to be a very compelling explanation for why one would spend slowly. As far as I could tell, it was in charities' best interest from a PR perspective to spend as fast as they could. They usually get pressure to spend. In fact, spending is one of the only things that you can really show. It's an objective number that can show you're doing something in a disaster relief situation. And so I always kind of felt that if the needs on the ground required more money, and if the charities should be spending more money, then they would have no incentives not to. But this was certainly one explanation that was raised. Another possibility is just the question of maybe they didn't have enough money and they held on to that money because they knew they were going to need it later. And I do think there is something to this explanation. There was a lot of money raised kind of in the context of Haiti's economy, which is very poor. I mean, if we kind of divided the amount of money available by the number of people affected, and it was, several years of income for each person, but easily could have been not enough to really undo all the damages and do all the reconstruction that needed to happen. So it's a little hard to say, but that's definitely a possibility that some of that money really did need to be saved for later. But to me, what we ended up concluding was the number one reason that money wasn't being spent so fast was that it couldn't be, was that it wouldn't be helpful, that there were only so many opportunities to do good, and there were certain aspects of the situation in Haiti that really depended on the government and on other actors and didn't depend on how much money was available. So a key one is the rubble. as of about a year after the earthquake, only 10 to 15% of the rubble was estimated to have been cleared. And this wasn't because people couldn't afford trucks to clear the rubble. It was a lot of it had to do with property rights issues and whose land is this and who's allowed to work here and whose rubble is this. And that was the reports we were reading was really made it look that way. And in fact, it's my belief that a lot of the money given to Haiti may have done harm, not good. It's definitely been a phenomenon both in Haiti and in past disasters that a lot of donors, when they see a disaster, what they do is they react by sending what's called, kind of in the aid business, called stuff we don't want. They'll take their old clothes and their old socks and they'll send them over without really sorting them, without really marking them. They might even send old medicines. They might send expired medicines. I think there were plenty of nonprofits that were in the business of taking these gifts, distributing them, making people feel good. And the problem is that in a disaster situation, it's not necessarily the case that what they really need is stuff. A lot of what they need is coordination and logistics. They need to be able to deliver the stuff. They need to be able to sort it. They need to be able to get it to the right people. And it's a very congested area. I mean, especially, in Haiti where there was so much damage in such a small area, it was like hard to navigate. And so this was one of the wake-up calls to me that if you give to the wrong organization, it's not just that you might not be doing good, you could be getting in the way. I mean, there's only so much room for people to be helping down there. And if you're not helping, you're probably hurting. There were instances in both Haiti and in the earlier Asian tsunami of medicines being incinerated because they were, clogging up the highways. So this is kind of how extreme it can get when donors are paying attention to what makes them feel good instead of what the needs are on the ground. So we were concerned about this, and in the years since the Haiti earthquake, we did our best to find out what organizations were doing the best work and what organizations were really being helpful so that next time there was a disaster, we could make a more helpful recommendation. And unfortunately, what we found is that it's obviously very hard to get information on who's being helpful on the ground in a disaster. There's all kinds of conflicting reports, and a lot of charities are just very, very vague about what they do. So what we've decided to do for the time being is instead of trying to grade charities on the quality of their work, which is just too hard to assess at this point, we're starting by grading them on transparency. We went to about 30 big name charities. This is not all of them. This is just an excerpt. And we looked through their press releases and we looked through their website and we looked at everything they had, 6-month report, 12-month report. And we just asked a simple question, which is, can we tell what they're doing? Can we tell how they're spending their money? Most of the time the answer was pretty much no, and some charities were clearer than others. So what we ended up doing is handing out kind of transparency ratings to say that at least next time in a disaster, at least let's reward the charities that were a little clearer about how they spent the money last time. And those would be the ones at the top of this chart. Doctors Without Borders, Partners in Health, and Direct Relief International. I think there were noticeable differences with all of them between the other charities and how clear they were about their activities. And we have all the details on our website, so it's easy for you to look at it and draw your own conclusions. So then another disaster did come along, and that was this year. That was the earthquake in Japan. And this was a very different situation because it was a much more severe earthquake, but it was in a much wealthier country. It's one of the biggest economies in the world. And so one of the interesting aspects of the earthquake in Japan and the relief effort was the behavior of major funders. This chart shows what the U.S. government was doing. USAID is our kind of official source of government assistance to overseas. And as you can see, I mean, Japan is our ally, and yet the U.S. gave a lot more to Haiti in the 30 days following the disaster than it gave to Japan. This is not a bureaucratic issue. This is true whatever agency or subdivision you look at. And it's definitely, an interesting question why this was happening. To me, the leading explanation was that it was all about perceived needs. So the more we looked on the Japan situation, and we pretty much had this viewpoint up since 3 days after the quake, but we've been continuing to research it and post updates. Our view is that the Japanese government and the Japanese Red Cross have the resources available locally to mount the best relief and response effort that they can, and that donations from international NGOs are not so much needed. So this is the government of Japan, refused the vast majority of offers it got, even from other other governments. This is a statement from OCHA that actually came out a little late in the process, but affirmed what we had found from other sources, which is that no international appeal had been launched for Japan because the government did have the resources, and because the bigger problem, again, in a disaster situation was coordination. So again, you've got this issue where someone just coming in, doing their own thing, you've got a fuel shortage, you've got congested roads, like that's not necessarily helping, and it could be hurting. Despite these issues, and despite the fact that there didn't seem to be necessarily a case for giving to Japan disaster relief, we saw charities being very aggressive with raising funds. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that when you work in the fundraising office of a charity, your job is to raise funds. And so a lot of charities will do that regardless of the needs on the ground. I thought World Vision was certainly an offender in this category. This is all from days after the quake, that they were already up on Google AdWords and very aggressive with them. Using language implying that they were going to be giving immediate relief, and yet if you look at their description of their own activities, they're on standby. Another, I think, a more mild offender, but still someone that I thought was not telling the whole story, was the American Red Cross. I think in the month following the quake, they basically decided to pass their money to the Japanese Red Cross, and that's a whole issue of how helpful that's going to be that I'll get to. But certainly in the days following the quake, this is what they had up. And they said on those rare occasions when donations exceed expenses for a specific disaster, contributions are used to prepare for and serve victims of other disasters. I think that disclaimer was there, and I don't think that they were expecting this to be a rare or unlikely occurrence. I mean, I think it was clear from day one that Japan is not like Haiti, and that there wasn't necessarily going to be a need for huge expenditures on the relief and recovery effort. And again, that's not to say that the relief and recovery effort wasn't expensive and challenging and important. It's just that there's limits to how much money can do in a situation like this. So what we did recommend in the Japan situation, we had two recommendations. Our top line recommendation was Doctors Without Borders. They're the ones who came out kind of at the top of our transparency rankings for Haiti. And in the Japan situation, they were actually explicitly saying that they were not raising money for Japan. So they were active in Japan. They were meeting limited needs, but they felt the needs were limited. And so they said, if you want to give us money, we're going to use it on other disasters. To us, this was great. We said, this is probably what all the charities are doing, but Doctors Without Borders is being straightforward about it, and they got our top score on transparency for Haiti. So our basic take, and it's a little bit of a counterintuitive thing to ask a donor to do, but we said, if this disaster has kind of, affected your emotions and made you want to do something for people in disasters, then give to this organization and reward them for being kind of the most accountable, honest disaster relief organization, and let them use that money on other disasters all over the world. And I think that was probably the most pertinent suggestion for most donors. Some people really wanted their money spent in Japan, not for the people with the direst needs, but even on even if it was going to be later reconstruction and restitution and compensating people, wanted their money spent in Japan. For them, we told them to go to the Japanese Red Cross because we felt that they were the ones most perceived as responsible for the relief effort, so they face a very different set of incentives from most charities. Most charities, will get credit for trying and will not get in any trouble unless they fail in a very visible, miserable way. The Red Cross usually gets blamed if anything goes wrong, and so we like the incentive structure faced by the Japanese Red Cross and the fact that they were responsible for coordinating and for basically running the response effort. The other thing we liked about the Japanese Red Cross is that they are actually giving out cash to survivors, or they will be. And this to us was another interesting observation about the charities' responses to the Japan situation, which is that a lot of these charities are talking about how they're going to be setting up child mental health counseling and vouchers to re-stimulate the economy and a whole host of kind of long-term rebuilding programs that to us we don't really understand the case for. I understand that if you're in a place like Haiti, the economy is arguably dysfunctional, arguably people don't know the best way to help themselves with money. I can see you providing services. But in Japan, that's a functioning economy, that's the developed world. Those people were self-sufficient before this quake hit. And to us, I have trouble seeing the argument for a rebuilding effort that doesn't simply consist in giving cash to survivors and letting them decide how to rebuild their own lives. Not only do I feel that way, but that's what the Japanese Red Cross is planning to do. And so to me, that's kind of, that's something that appealed to us as the best way to respond to this disaster. I think what both of these disasters illustrate is something that's become very core to our process, which is the room for more funding issue, which is that even if a charity is doing very great, very important, and very expensive work, it doesn't mean that more money will lead to more of that work. And you could see this in the disaster situations that, there was a lot of suffering in Haiti. There was a lot that needed to be done, but it wasn't like you could put in more money and get more results because you had these logistical issues, you had these government issues. In Japan, again, a lot of suffering, a lot of money needed to be spent, a lot needed to be done, but you weren't going to make the relief and recovery effort look different by giving more money. And a lot of that money is going to end up being cash grants to survivors, which I think is a good thing, but is not the same as what a lot of people had in mind when they were wanting to give to Japan. So this is a very core part of our viewpoint, is that it's important to understand the marginal impact of your donation. And that's one of the biggest questions we ask charities in our general process. So with all that in mind, just to talk quickly about this kind of issue of disaster relief versus everyday aid. I mean, disaster relief tends to get attention and emotions up in the way that everyday aid doesn't. And yet there are people all over the world every day who are suffering from treatable and curable illnesses. And it's our view, for a couple reasons, that probably you're going to be more effective as a donor giving to help those people than trying to respond to a disaster. One of the reasons is that in a disaster, there tends to be so much attention and so much money that you do run quickly into room for more funding issues. Another reason is it's easier to assess and apply the right incentives in everyday aid and to learn from what you're doing and to correct course and all that. And then a third issue is we've just crunched some numbers, and some of these disasters where all the numbers are in, the amount spent per person has been extraordinarily high, and we think you put that against the amount spent per person on the everyday aid and what results they're getting, and we think a donor can do a lot more good by giving to everyday aid. So with that in mind, I'm going to give a real quick overview of how we do think about everyday aid, and I'm not covering most of what we've done on this, but just kind of a quick overview of how we think about global health and international aid. This is a really illustrative case to me. This is the case of play pumps. A play pump is basically a merry-go-round that pumps water. And it's a very appealing idea that kind of kids play on this thing. It pumps the water. It saves work for the women who would be pumping the water otherwise. And this was a very popular idea that got a lot of people excited. And this is a picture of it in action, where the kids are playing on the merry-go-round. They're excited. They're having a good time. Win-win. There was an economist in Malawi who kind of felt something smelled off about this. He's the one who actually took this picture. And to hear him tell it, he says, this was not a case where these kids were playing happily on the merry-go-round where I walked in. It was more that they saw my camera and they kind of knew what I was expecting. And they jumped to the merry-go-round and started playing. And in fact, if I walk away and take the camera somewhere else, look what happens. So it's a very different situation from what people had kind of been picturing. This guy put in a lot of effort into getting a picture of the well under kind of normal conditions. This is what he said was the closest he could do. You see women operating the merry-go-round by hand as children turn out not to play on merry-go-rounds all day. This may sound kind of silly, but the fact is that this intervention was backed by anyone and everyone, which to me is a very scary fact about international aid. I mean, just look at the list of backers here. The U.S. government, I mean, that's a big one. The Clinton Global Initiative, the World Bank. I mean, everyone who was behind this idea that upon reflection really seemed to be kind of doing harm and not even failing to do good, but doing harm. And one of the things that I can't show on the slideshow, but it's a very interesting video, this same economist made a video of his friend filling a bucket using the merry-go-round and also using a hand pump. And it took something like 5 times as long using the merry-go-round. It was also incredibly exhausting and demeaning, and the guy was dizzy afterward because he's running around the merry-go-round. And he then interviewed villagers, and they were saying that the hand pumps were taken out to put these merry-go-rounds in, and they wanted their hand pumps back. So when you look at that whole story and you look at who supported it, it's a very scary situation. And to me, it just reflects the beginning of this slideshow and where we're coming from, which is that when people don't use their brains to give to charity, and when they're giving because of a good story or because it sounds good or because their friends said to give there, you just get a giant disconnect between who's good at helping people and who's good at raising money. So this is just a list of other struggles in international aid that have raised similar concerns for us. I mean, it can be pretty amazing how some of these failures play out. If you've read White Man's Burden, you might remember this, but there was one project that someone kind of went and took a real good look at and discovered that the reason the agricultural assistance program wasn't working is because the people they were working with weren't farmers, they were miners. It's just very easy to miss stuff like that because we're looking at different cultures and you've got several layers of management between the donors and the people on the ground. So how does GiveWell try to deal with this? I mean, what we're basically looking for in a charity is we're just looking for very strong evidence of effectiveness, and that evidence of effectiveness has a lower burden of proof for us when they're doing a program that has an excellent track record on its own. So what we've done is we kind of reviewed the academic literature. There are some things that have worked in international aid that have worked incredibly well, that have reduced infant mortality and other measures that certainly seem to be ends in themselves. So we've made a list of particularly promising interventions, and we've picked out we've basically gone after as many charities as we could that were the appropriate size and focus and U.S. registration. And if someone was focused on proven health activities or had strong kind of technical reports on their impact, they got a closer look from us. And then we do these deep dives where we'll look at a charity and we'll kind of go very much in depth. We'll try to ask, what do you do? How do we trace the money from me to the activities you're carrying out? What is your evidence that it works? What are all the concerns about the evidence? What are your responses to that? Is it cost effective? Is this a good use of money, or is this something that's not one of the best options on the table for improving lives? And the room for more funding question, which I mentioned earlier, we'll really try to get at what is the impact of the marginal dollar. If I give you more money, you're going to do more of what? So as a quick discussion of what that looks like when we find a charity that we like, this is our top-rated charity, Village Reach. Village Reach is a health system logistics charity. It's something that is kind of it's one of the least sexy things you can do in international aid. It's all about kind of trucks and logistics and scheduling. What their pilot project is they went into an area of Mozambique where health centers kept running out of health supplies, such as vaccines, and they were trying to figure out why this was happening, and they kind of found three problems. One is that the health workers were responsible for collecting their own vaccines, which often means that you have to jump on a motorcycle and ride it like 2 hours to the town, and so no surprise, a lot of times they were, running out, that they weren't keeping stocked as well as they could. So Village Reach tried to address this by putting in a dedicated logistics team, basically a few people going around in a Land Rover and delivering all the health supplies so the health workers could focus on their jobs and yet always know that they would be well stocked. Another problem that Village Reach saw was the cold chain. So they saw that fridges were being powered by wood fires. And again, this is a much harder thing to sell than merry-go-rounds that pump water, but Village Reach got very excited about propane as a better way to power fridges. So they started trucking up propane from South Mozambique. They discovered that not only could they get it to the health centers, but they could sell it to the local hotel. And so they spun that off into a for-profit. They figured that didn't need to be supported by donations. And the third thing they did was management information system. They just felt that the system was not in place to track when they were running out of vaccines and when they weren't, and how they could fix it and what they could do about it. So that's all fine. I mean, a lot of charities have great sounding stories of what they fixed. What really makes Village Reach stand out in my mind is their evidence. This is one of the charts from their pilot project, and they kind of entered around the beginning of this chart. You see that stockouts are extremely common. This is the percentage of health centers each month with a stockout and at least one vaccine, and that's when they run out of the vaccine. And then you can see that there was a pretty drastic difference, and stockouts actually hit zero. And then there was a time when Village Reach exited, and the government kind of went back to the old model, and that's a bit of a story in itself. But this is one piece of data. They also did a big survey of vaccination coverage rates in this province and in a nearby province, and there were a lot of other elements that are all written up on our website. What our case for Village Reach is basically that their pilot project did work. It did save lives. It saved lives very cost effectively, and now they need a few $1 million to do more of this, to basically scale it up across the rest of Mozambique. And they're not getting this $1 million from anywhere else. And so that to us is kind of the slam dunk, the closest thing we've gotten to a slam dunk donation opportunity. We've raised a total of about $1.5 million for Village Reach, and they're about a $2 million a year organization normally, so this has made a big difference to their ability to expand, and we've been tracking that as well and providing quarterly updates on them. So that's what kind of a top charity means to us, and that's where we'd like to see more donors giving. And we're currently working on finding more top-rated charities. I mean, we have multiple recommended charities at our website, and we're always looking to find more great ones. So I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit about our mission and how we evaluate ourselves. The basic idea of GiveWell is twofold. One is just to get money to great charities, and that in itself, in the short term, saves lives and improves lives. And the other is kind of a second order goal, which is that if we can start getting money to these great charities, we can start changing the game and changing incentives. Because right now, if you're Village Reach and you do all this great evaluation and this great programming, you still don't get rewarded unless you can tell a great story. Whereas if you're Play Pumps and your program is fundamentally harmful, but you do tell a great story, you do get rewarded. We're trying to change that game as much as we can. We track the money that goes to our top charities as a direct result of our recommendation. So we're pretty conservative about that. That would mean clicks that came through our website, people who explicitly said, I gave to you because of GiveWell. And that number is, definitely growing. And I would say that in 2010 was the first time that it was really significant enough to say, okay, this is a number that made a big difference to a charity. If you're a charity, you should really think about getting better at evaluation and producing more evidence of effectiveness, because you can raise serious money to be able to do it. So that's kind of, how we look at ourselves and our progress and our goals. And what we're really trying to do is we want to see more donors give to these top charities, because we want to change what charities are rewarded for. And our ultimate vision is a world in which donors are rewarding charities, not just for effectiveness in telling a story, but for effectiveness in really getting it done and improving lives. So that's all I got, and happy to take questions now. Okay, you.
So, how would you scale your own organization? It seems like evaluating charities in detail is a lot of work, and you've tried to restrict your investigations to the ones you think are actually going to be worth investigating.
That's right.
But probably the case, there's more that you could be doing if you had the resources to do it. So how do you make that trade-off?
Yeah, I kind of have three answers to the question of how GiveWell scales. One answer is that we don't know yet. So one fundamental difference between us and the rest of the charity evaluators is that we think this is a very new sector. We think nobody really has figured out how to do credible charity analysis, and I would say that we're the closest, but we're still learning a lot, and we're still changing our methodology all the time, and we're just not at the point where we want to systemize it and turn it into a formula and scale it up as big as possible. Will we get to that point? Can you turn charities into something that can be quantified that way? I don't know the answer to that question. Right now we feel that we can't. And so for now the answer is, we're still figuring things out, and that's one answer. Another answer is that we kind of don't need to scale up. If a few of us are working and find great charities that need, let's say, a total of $1 billion, well, that's it. Then we have got the ability to move $1 billion to where it can do more good. So there's no necessary reason that you need to evaluate 1 million charities or have 200 employees in order to help $1 billion find a better home and do more good. Yeah.
So, follow up. So, do you sense that you have or could have any impact on these sort of large governmental or corporate based donation systems?
Right. That was going to be my third answer. So the third way that we scale is by setting an example and basically saying, we're putting our reasoning out here. We're subjecting it to external scrutiny. And that doesn't just mean leaving it out there. We have processes for, definitely soliciting external scrutiny. And that's something that you can check out on our website. And when we do this, as a result, our research is more credible, our brand is better, and more money goes to our top charities. So, hey, foundations, if you were to do the same thing, maybe you'd reap the same rewards. This is something that I think is a realistic way for us to have an impact way beyond our organization. Foundations are slow entities. They're slow movers. So we've been around for a few years. Our brand is, has been stronger the last year or two. The first couple of years we were really just kind of figuring out our way along. So we haven't seen any foundation do this yet, but I do believe that we will. And I think that's a way we can have impact beyond our staff.
What are your thoughts on local everyday?
Say it again.
Local everyday aid.
You mean local, like Bay Area?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think local is less of a good fit for us for a few reasons, like just for our process. Because one, we're serving an international audience. If we can point to one of these great global health charities, people all over the place will be interested. We have much more limited impact when we go local. Another issue for us is, I used to be really focused on the U.S. myself, and I used to care about inner city education above all else. And in the process of doing this research, I've just changed my mind. I mean, I just think that people overseas are in such a more extreme condition of poverty that your money can go so much further there that I've just kind of lost interest in the local stuff myself. And that's personal. That's not something I'm saying is right. It's all about, what your values are and who you want to help and why. So, I'm not trying to claim this as some kind of statement of fact, but GiveWell does tend to pursue the causes we're passionate about and pick up an audience that shares a lot of our personal values. And to the extent we influence other causes, we expect it to be in the way we discuss, that we set a model for transparency. So local is not something that we focus on a lot, but I think in principle, those same questions that we ask can be applied to local organizations. And we do have a section of our website linked from the front page where we'll basically take any cause you like, even the ones that we've never covered, and at least give you a starting point of critical questions to ask for charities in that cause. So I'd be interested, if you want to look at food banks, we've never looked at food banks, but we have a list of critical questions for food banks. And so we'd certainly be interested in someone taking a look at those, asking those questions, seeing what answers they get, sharing their thoughts with us.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a few examples of criticism you received from the outside, just like the processes.
Yeah. From the outside, I mean, so what, some of the most common criticisms we get are that we focus too much on what's measurable. We look for strong evidence of impact. And I think it's like, it comes down to a worldview thing. I mean, to me, I feel that the challenges these charities are working on are hard enough that I feel better with the strong evidence of impact. But we're also looking for ways to broaden our process, and we're always learning. And so we've taken some of that criticism to heart. And we've asked things like, how could we put a place in our process for groups that aren't as proven but have higher upside if it does work? Or groups that just kind of, they don't have the evaluation formally, but if you go visit them, then you got to believe it's working. So we're trying to incorporate that. I think that's a criticism we've gotten since day one. I think the criticism has been valid since day one, and we've known it since day one. But it's kind of, you have to get more familiar with the sector to start branching out in what you consider evidence. To get more narrow, I mean, we invited one guy who had written a paper on aid agencies with Bill Easterly to review our work and to kind of take 10 hours to find the best charity he could, and we offered to give $2,500 to that charity in exchange for his time. This is kind of a new way that we measure our own accountability. He picked a charity that's not one of our recommended charities. He did find it on our site. He did say our site was by far the best resource for this, but it was actually kind of similar. He had more of an emphasis on the upside, on like what would this be if it worked, and less on what's proven. And we had a conversation with him. We posted the transcript. I mean, it's all very interesting in my view. We posted it to the blog too.
On that topic, you said people that know the sector can really help. I wonder if you look at sort of a peer review model. And if you've got charities commenting on each other, that's
Yeah, charities really don't like to get into arguments about effectiveness. It's just not the culture. It's like what I said at the beginning of the talk, that it's almost like you're from Mars when you start getting critical. And so it's a tough road. We do what we can to facilitate it. So every time we give a charity a review, we tell them, if you want to write a response, you can. And we won't edit it. We will help you with the formatting. We'll put it on this charity response tab so it's like very easy to see from our review. And some of them have taken us up on it, but very few. I think generally people at charities, they don't want to get into these arguments, and there's a whole lot of reasons behind that. In the back.
I know you started doing some work in India. Can you say a little bit about what you're doing there?
Sure. I mean, we moved to India. Like our whole staff moved to India for 4 months last year. It wasn't really any GiveWell project that we did it for, because we stayed there and we did our desk work. So we did our like normal everyday work, but it was kind of, we were all personally interested in doing it. Because we coordinated it, we could do it without losing the organizational effectiveness. And we knew it would give us an opportunity to just learn some stuff. So it was a very open-ended, it wasn't like there was any particular thing we were trying to do, but we visited about 20 charities. We wrote up a lot of notes. We've now published all the notes. And in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be making a series of blog posts, probably like 3 blog posts that say what we think we learned and what we thought of the different groups. And there was one guy who gave us $10,000 to redistribute to the group of our choice that we saw in India. So we did that process, and we're going to write up our reasoning behind that. So it was kind of experimenting with a different model of evaluation, the kind of walk around and see how things feel model. And we had a lot of, I mean, I could talk all day about that. We're going to be publishing a lot of content on this. So I would say just watch our blog. Yep.
So I wanted to ask about the metric you use to measure the effectiveness of the charity. So often in your reports on your website, so I see that such and such a charity is a great charity because it costs only, say, $1,000 per life saved.
Yep. Yep.
But my objection to that is that once you save someone's life, you're not done. You can save someone's life and they die 2 weeks later.
Sure.
You can save someone's life and they die 40 years later. So why not use a metric that takes that into account, like expected life years added or dollars?
Right. There's problems with both metrics. If you look at life years, one of the problems you have is you start counting infants as worth way more than teenagers, when in fact studies show that people find the death of like teenagers and young adults to be far more tragic than the death of infants. So you can muddle it all up, and it can get very hard to keep it all straight. Basically, our approach to metrics, well, to answer your other point about what if the person dies the next day from something else, that is a very common concern. That's something a lot of people worried about, that I was worried about. We have put work and put a write-up on this exact question, which is, what is the standard of living in the developing world? When you save a life, what kind of life do you save? We've collected all the information we can. Generally, I think that if you save a life in the developing world, those people are usually going to live and have not to 80, but to 60 or so, 40 to 60. They have a good chance of living to that age. So we think that the dollars per life saved is meaningful. B, the life years has problems of its own. And C, we do use both. So we look at the standard metric, which is dollars per disability adjusted life year, and we also look at dollars per life saved. But we're very ballpark about it because we don't think that this really captures the full impact. We think these estimates are very messy, and we think it's much more important to be confident in the charity you're giving to, that they're actually getting it done, than it is to nitpick the cost effectiveness, which usually the confidence intervals are just beyond anything you can imagine, and the room for error. So we basically are looking for groups that are around $1,000 life saved or the equivalent in disability, just the life years averted, and we'll take those and say those are all best in class. We're not going to distinguish between them. That answer your question?
Yeah. So if you had, if you could spend, say, $1,000 and save the life, that would then live to 60 in one country.
Versus someone right.
Would your method agree that saving the life that would live to 80 would be better, everything else being equal?
Yes. Yeah.
It's too hard to determine where that's the case.
That's right. I mean, we just haven't found making that distinction doesn't end up making a difference for which charity we recommend. It would cause a lot of guesswork that wouldn't ultimately lead to a different recommendation. But I do agree with you in principle. And if we started really being able to run into places where it was clearly an issue and we could quantify it, then we would take it into account. I mean, one way we take it into account is we separate U.S. and developing world. Because in the U.S., it's much more expensive to help someone, but people in the U.S. have higher quality lives that you can enable. So it's all subjective. But we do at least separate the causes by that, so you can clearly see what we're talking about where. Yeah.
So I'm curious about your motivating the charities to be more transparent, to look at more fundraising. But is it possible that some of the larger ones are actually more successful by not being transparent, so you won't be able to overcome that? Because now they will lose some of their ability to fundraise.
Sorry, can you explain that again?
Well, the large charities, you'd like them to be more transparent.
Right.
But they're large implies that they're already successful at fundraising.
Right.
Is it possible that by asking them to be more transparent, their fundraising effectiveness drops?
It's possible, I'm personally skeptical that any charity is going to lose money by being more transparent, because the dynamic that I observe in charity is that people who don't care about this stuff just ignore it, and they'll give for social reasons, and nobody's going to say, well, these guys published a study and it has some methodological issues, so I'm not going to give, even though I gave when all I had was a story. So I'm pretty skeptical that there's much for them to lose, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is stuff for them to lose. I mean, we're just trying to create a subset of charities that is playing by rules that are conducive to rewarding the people who are best at helping others. Other questions? Yeah.
So money spent is often for material things and sometimes for expert help in these things done. how do you measure the amount of volunteers that an organization can organize given some limited amount of resource? And so I'm an open source developer. I work on open source projects a lot.
Sure.
I know that the volunteer effort, the community around something, is often more important than how much money is going into it. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, what we're trying to look at is kind of outcomes and dollars spent. I mean, just, what did you accomplish all in? And how much did it cost all in? And so if you use volunteers, it should be reflected in that metric.
Often the volunteers they don't provide the transparency. So in code, I can see that a patch got submitted or something happened there, but I don't see that another villager got help because there was a volunteer who was trained to do something. That doesn't come back to the original organization anymore.
So you're
the volunteers who work in that community might not be reporting everything in the way that you're looking for it.
Right. So what you're describing is really sounds like it's kind of about charities underestimating their impact.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
how to estimate the effect of volunteers.
Right. I mean, again, this is one of those reasons that I think if you focus in too much on cost effectiveness, you're going to make bad decisions. I think what you want to do is you want to find charities that it's like, well, they're clearly what they're doing is pretty cost effective and they're really good at it. And that's who we look for, and that's hard enough to find. So I mean, I completely agree with you. There's all these other issues. I mean, if you're doing tuberculosis treatment versus immunizations, well, tuberculosis treatment is more likely to be in urban areas. So then those people are more likely to be able to help others after you save their life. I mean, you can't quantify this stuff. You basically want to find organizations that are just doing great cost-effective work. Yeah.
How do you evaluate sort of health of an organization, charitable organization, in terms of its longevity and size, I guess? How does that factor into your evaluation of charities, whether it's been around for 3 years, 15 years?
Yeah.
Whether it's helping 10,000 people or 100,000 people? Does that factor into your evaluation?
Right. Before I answer, actually, there's something I just realized I forgot. Brian, would you mind passing around a sheet of paper so people could put their email addresses on it? Thanks. Okay. So how do we evaluate organizational health? I mean, traditionally, that's been the main thing people look at in charity is they'll kind of, take organizational health and financials as an end in itself. And when you do that across a large scale, it takes a lot of work. The way we work is by the time we get to a charity that we feel good about their work, we've narrowed it down to such a small number that check on the kind of organizational validity and on the fact that they're, financially stable is usually just such a tiny part of our process. So we look at their financials. I mean, any charity that we've given a top score to, you'll see financial analysis that's kind of in the same genre as the charity navigator analysis on their website. It's just a very small part of the process. But it's not too hard to tell what kind of shape a charity's in. I mean, you just look at how old it is, how much assets it has compared to how much expenses it has. If you've already established that they're helping people and not spending too much to do it, then you're not terribly worried about fraud. And it's more a matter of just, are they going to exist a year from now? So that's something we do look at. It's just a small part of our process. Previously, we've said $1 million, and that's how we only looked at 400 organizations for our original report on international aid. Now we're going smaller because now we're basically saying, anyone we find that they can give us a convincing need for more funding and we feel good about them, and they've done enough that we feel like they're a legit organization and not just some kids with ideas, that's something we're going to feel good about. So, I mean, we're pretty. We have had a size limit, but I think we're getting to the point where it's just not as important to us because if a charity has accomplished something, I mean, that tells you a lot of what you need to know. Yep.
We talked a lot about human aid organizations. What about environmental organizations like
Right.
WWF?
Right.
Because those are also hard to evaluate.
Oh, yeah. They're harder to evaluate. Yeah, that's an area we haven't looked at yet. That's an area we want to get to eventually. I can't promise that it'll be anytime soon. That's a very hard area to examine. Other areas we haven't looked at that we want to, disease research. I think some of the biggest success stories in philanthropy are all about funding people to just do basic research, something that's very hard to evaluate and quantify. But I do think that we are eventually gonna have something to say on all these matters. And for the moment, you can go to our webpage and you can see our critical questions for environmental organizations. And I would love it if nobody's ever used it. So I don't know about this, but I would love it if someone went to our list of critical questions and started calling charities and asking them those questions and started sharing what they found with us.
You're looking for more volunteers.
Yeah. We do have a volunteer process because we do at this point our research is kind of sprawling and we always need to keep it up to date, and then we're always soliciting more external feedback. So if there are people who want to volunteer, certainly shoot us an email or put your email on that sheet. Other questions? 3, 2, 1. Okay. But if you haven't put your name on the sheet that's being passed around, please do me a favor and do put your email on that sheet before you go. Do you know where people know where it is? Okay, cool. So anyone who hasn't gotten to it, please do that before you go. I'd appreciate it. And I'll be here to answer more questions. And I'm going to lunch with Brian. Anyone who wants to join us is welcome. Thanks, everyone.